We continue today with the 17th chapter of the book of Shmuel. Yesterday, we met a new character, David, King David. But there is another story about King David where we seem to not know who he is. Yesterday was introduced to Shaul because of his great music, and here we're going to meet him in a different way. And what happens is it begins with a war with the Plishtim. Vayasfu Plishtim et machaneim lemilchama vayasfu socha asher lihuda vayachanu bein socha uvein azeka be'efes tamim. So the Philistines, they get their forces together to go to war. V'Shaul v'ish Yisrael nasfu vayachanu be'emek ha'ela vayarchu milchama likrat Plishtim. And Shaul and the men of Israel, they also, so now they gather their troops together and they're ready to go to war against the Philistines, right? So we've had this before. In the past, we know that Shaul has fought with the Philistines. He was very successful in previous battles, but there is something that's different about this battle. They're both on hills with a valley between them. And a man, a champion. The word Beinayim is a strange word. Does it mean something in the middle, like Bain? And his name was Goliath, and he was 6 cubits in a span tall. Unclear exactly how tall he was. He was extraordinarily tall. He was the tallest guy around. That's what's clear. He's taller than everybody else is, and that's what differentiates him. That's what makes him different than everybody else. And so he's taller than everybody else. And we're told, and he has this gigantic helmet made of bronze and a breastplate that was worth tons of money. And he has, it basically saying he has a gigantic spear. So he's bigger than everybody else, and obviously because of that, he is terrifying. He's somebody that everybody in the Jewish army, and probably the Philistine army as well, are terrified. And he stood up in front of the army of Israel, and he said, he said, why should we go to war? Pick one person. I'm the champion of the Philistines, and you guys pick somebody, and we'll go to war. We'll just be, me, mano a mano, me versus you guys. So why should we go to war? And if I win, then you will be our slaves, and if you win, then we'll be your slaves. We'll be your servants. Why should we go to war in this way? He says, I defy the ranks of Israel, and I blaspheme the ranks of Israel. Get somebody to fight with me. And when Shaul and all of Israel heard, they were dismayed, they were stricken, they were scared. Now we have to remember, this guy, Goliath, is described as being extraordinarily tall, right? He is a giant. And while we can't say necessarily that the person on the opposite side is a full-fledged giant, we know that Shaul has been described over and over again as a person of great height. And so it appears that the person who Goliath is testing to fight with him is none other than Shaul. But everybody's terrified. And then we move out and we go somewhere else. It talks about David, a son of Yishai, who had 8 sons. We heard that yesterday. The first 7 wouldn't become king, and the 8th was in the days of Shaul. He was already getting old, advanced in years, and we're told that his 3 older sons went to battles in verse 13. They went to Eliab, and Avinadav, and Shammah, the 3 that we met that God said were not going to be the next king of Israel, as opposed to verse 14. But David was the youngest. The 3 oldest had followed Saul, but David doesn't go to the battle. David stays back from the battle. David is not one who's going to go and be in the fight. David would go back and forth from attending on Shaul to shepherd his father's flock at Bethlehem, right? So we know that David at this point is a is right, is Shaul's arms bearer. He's been described as, of course, the musician to Shaul. So it seems here that he's going back and forth, and that makes a lot of sense. And for 40 days, this Philistine Goliath comes down and comes up, challenging Bnei Israel. Who's going to fight with me? Of course, 40. We know the number 40 years in the desert, 40, Moshe was 80 years old, is twice times 40, over and over again. 40 represents a significant amount of time. So this man, Goliath, he has been blaspheming Israel now for 40 days, challenging somebody to go and to fight with him. And of course, everybody is terrified. Nobody is going to fight with him. And so Yishai tells David, go to the battlefield and go check on your brothers, see how they're doing. Bring them this verse 15, 18, bring them some cheese, bring their captain some things, so he'll treat him well. And we're told that they're in, again, his brothers are there in the valley, right where the war is supposed to happen. That's where they are, that's where they were before, and that's where they therefore remain in this battle against the Philistines. And so David gets up early in the morning, and he first moves the flocks around, and then he follows his father's instruction, and he goes out to the battle. And Yisrael and the Plishtim, we're told in verse 21, have drawn up the battle lines, and David leaves his baggage with a man in charge of the baggage. That's the first interesting thing to think about, right? David is not with the baggage, even though he's a nobody. David leaves his baggage with somebody who's supposed to handle the baggage. And of course, the contrasting fact, Shaul, who was hiding amongst the Kalim, of course, right? So that's the first thing that first comparison here. And let's come back to that in a little bit. And he asks his brothers, what's doing? And while he's talking to them, Goliath comes out, and he's embarrassing, saying these things, get somebody to challenge me. And let's look at verse 24. All this men, they to Israel. And David overhears the people saying, you see that man scaring us. Anybody who kills him is going to be rewarded handsomely by the king. He's going to make him a rich man. The king is going to give him his daughter in marriage. He's not going to have to even pay any taxes. And David says to the men in verse 26, and David said, really? That's going to be done to the person who kills this Philistine, this uncircumcised. Remember the pejorative term for the Philistines, calling them uncircumcised, who's disgracing Israel. That's what's going to be done to him. And they say, what's happened? Now in verse 28, interestingly, and this is a good question to ask. Verse 28, Eliab hears what the people are saying, and here's David, of course, trying to figure out what's going on. And he says, what are you doing here on the battlefield? Why did you leave the sheep? Go back into the wilderness. I know you have a big ego, and you wanted to see the war. And it's unclear here because these chapters, it's not clear. We'll see, because Shaul doesn't seem to know at all who David is later in the chapter. Is this something that precedes David, the last chapter, with David being brought into the palace as a musician? And that's only used there because that's sort of a chapter we wanted to have the narrative structure where it's Shaul is removed from kingship, and the idea of him God being taken away from him, and thus where is God going? God is going and enveloping and being with David instead. And that's sort of an introductory chapter, but this might have happened before. It's unclear what's going on. We'll see that again in the end of the chapter. And David said, what have I done to you? We're in verse 29. I was only asking. And David turns away and he asks somebody else some questions, and people are telling him the answer. Verse 31, and somehow word gets to Shaul that there's somebody here who's saying, who is this Philistine who is embarrassing, who is shaming Bnei Yisrael? And therefore they take him eventually to speak with Shaul. And we're in verse 32. David says, Don't worry about it. Don't be scared. Your servant will go and fight that Philistine. And Shaul says back to David, 33, you can't fight him. You're just a young boy. And that man is a great warrior for decades. Look at him. David says back to him, El Shaul, Ro'ef 34, Haya Avdechala Aviv Batzonu Vaharivet Hadovin Asa Sameha Eder. Your servant, I was watching my dad's sheep, and a lion and a bear would come and they carry off an animal. They'd come and take a sheep. They'd come and, right, they'd be moving. I didn't know there were bears in Israel, and these are more mountain lions than think of, lions with great manes, but clearly something bigger. And I would go and I would fight the bear. I would fight the lion. I would save the sheep that attacked me. I would seize it by the beard. I would take it and I would strike it down. He said, I defeated the lion and the bear and this Philistine, this uncircumcised barbarian, this Philistine. He's like one of them. He's embarrassing the ranks of the living God, and I'm going to take him down. Right? Bnei Yisrael is the sheep, the bear, the lion are the big guy is Goliath, and David says, I've defeated them before and I've defeated them again. And that's what he says in 37. Again, I can go do it. And Shaul says to David at the end of 37, go and God will be with you. We're in 38. So Shaul gets David clothed in his own garments. He gives him his right. We saw before in a previous chapter, the only Israelites who had great weapons were Shaul and Yonatan. And so David is going to fight Goliath, not Shaul. So Shaul gives him his armor. And he gives him his sword over his garments. And David's wearing this very heavy armor. And David tries to walk, but he's not used to it. And David says to Shaul, and David said to Shaul, I can't walk in these, for I'm not used to them. And David takes them off. So what does he do? He takes his stick, he picks up a few smooth stones, and he puts them in his pocket, in his shepherd bag, and his sling. And it's not a sling that you would pull back. It's a sling that you would sort of shake and throw that way. And he approaches the Philistine. And this to me is very significant, these verses, because what these verses are telling us is David is not going to step into the shoes of Shaul. David is not going to wear his clothing. Shaul leads Bnei Yisrael in one way, and David is going to lead Bnei Yisrael in a completely different way. Yes, eventually he's going to be the king who succeeds Shaul, the king of all of Israel, but he's not going to do it in the same way that Shaul does it. He cannot wear Shaul's clothing. He has to be himself, and he will be himself and do things in a different way. The Philistine was coming closer, and David is next to him, and the Philistine sees David and he scorns him because David is right. He's a young lad and he's ruddy, he's red, and he's nice look. He doesn't look like a warrior, right? Although we said Edom reminds us of Esau, so David seems to have some warrior to him, we know. And the Plishti says to David, we're in verse 43, the Philistine said, am I a dog that you come against me with sticks, right? You think I'm nothing? You're just going to hit me with a stick? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine says to David in 44, approach me, come here, so I can give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field. And now we're going to see that attitude, which his brothers said about David before. Vayomer David al Plishti, we're in 45. David says, you can have your sword, you can have your spear, you can have a javelin. I don't need anything because I am coming to you in the name representing God, the Lord of hosts, God who is in charge of the ranks of Israel whom you've defied. On this day, God is going to deliver you to my hands. I'm going to kill you. I will behead you. I'm going to give your carcass to the Philistine camp, and the birds and the beasts are going to eat it, and all of the earth will know that the God of Israel is supreme. And everybody will know it's not about the sword. It's not about the spear. It's about God. God is the one who fights the battles for Bnei Yisrael. That is what David says to this man. And this is, of course, it's like we referenced Tehillim yesterday, reference again, right? Hey, where in Uvalat Zion, they come with their chariots, they come with their weapons. And we come mentioning the Lord God. God is the one who's going to lead us in battle. So the Philistine comes to approach David, and David runs up to the battle line to face the Philistine. David is not scared. David takes his smooth, so it's a sharp stone. He puts it into his he puts it into the sling to shoot it, and he throws it. It hits the Philistine in the forehead, and it sinks into his forehead, and the Philistine falls down onto the ground. And thus David killed the Philistine with a sling in the stone. He struck him down and killed him, and David had no sword. A doctor who was once discussing this chapter said that probably this giant had a disease of gigantism, and that was probably part of the problem here, was his gigantism, and that's part of the reason why he probably died so easily, because he probably had brittle bones. But of course, it's a great miracle, because that's what David still defeats him when nobody else can. And now we're told in 51, and David runs up to the Philistine camp. He takes the sword of Goliath, this gigantic sword. He pulls it from the sheath. He cuts off his head, and the Philistines saw that their warrior was dead, and they disperse. They run. 52. And Bnei Yisrael v'akum anshe Yisrael v'Yehuda v'yeru v'erdufu et haPlishtim ad boach Hagai v'ad sharei Ekron v'yeplu chalei Plishtim aderech Sha'arayim v'ad gat v'ad Ekron. When Bnei Yisrael see that this Philistine is dead and that the other ones have started to disperse and run, Bnei Yisrael, they have a sense of great victory, and they have a great confidence, and they run after the Philistines. They chase them all the way back towards to Gaza, to Ekron, and they attack them. So Bnei Yisrael return from chasing the Philistines. They loot their camp. Very stranger. David takes the head of the Philistine and sticks it in Jerusalem. Why does he stick it in Jerusalem? I don't know. We don't know anything about Jerusalem up to this point. So is this telling something that's in the future? David is going to bring it to Jerusalem, and that seems to be what many of the commentaries, the Malbim and others say, because it doesn't make sense why he would bring it. Jerusalem is not a city of significance at this point in time. But he also, he takes the sword, the spear, the shield of Goliath, and he places it somewhere. Verse 55, and this is what I was mentioning earlier. When after Shaul has tried to give him his arms, his armor, his sword, and David has refused it, and David walks into battle, right? David doesn't say, I'm the son of Yishai. He just says, I was watching the sheep of my father, and this is what happens. Shaul turns to Avner, his uncle in general, and says, who is this young man? And Avner says, I have no idea. And the king says, find out who this young fellow is. And when David returns after killing the Philistine with the head of Shaul, and you've probably seen paintings of it, Avner brings him to Shaul. Vayomer lav Shaul ben mi atanar. Vayomer David ben Abdecha Yishai Beit Halachmi. He says, I am this David, the son of your servant Yishai of Bethlehem. So it's a very strange ending to this chapter. What do you mean? In the last chapter, we were told that Shaul knows David very well, that David plays the harp for him and gets him out of his bad moods. David has become his arms bearer. So it appears that this is a story that takes place prior to that story, which would also explain why when the description is given in last chapter, if you remember the last chapter, the description, right, when the Saul's servant said, can we bring a great musician? And one of the servants says, oh, I know a guy. He's a great musician. He's very valiant, and he's a great warrior, and he's very handsome, right? Those are descriptions of David based upon this chapter. So David is here. He's somebody bests Goliath. But when after this, Shaul gets into these terrible moods, they ask for a great musician, and David comes to the palace in that way. David from this chapter doesn't seem to get very rich, doesn't seem to have the taxes removed from his family, doesn't seem to get a daughter of Shaul as to be his wife. He goes back home. And so maybe it seems in many ways that this story precedes David being brought to the palace. Does it precede him being named king by Shmuel? I don't know. And that comes back, interestingly, to the question with Eliav. When Eliav says to him, what is your problem, David? Why did you come here to the battle? Why are you so impudent? Go back home. Is he saying it to protect his brother because he knows his brother is going to be king? Or is he saying it before that because his brother's got a little bit of, delusions of grandeur? And he says, you're a little nothing. Go back home. You're a little boy. And he knows that his brother has delusions of grandeur. But those illusions, of course, are not delusions, and they're not illusions. David will best this Philistine and will best so many more of them. And the reason why is it's not about David. David is not about himself. David's life is about God. It's all about God being with him. And this is the story that is evident. He will make many mistakes in his life, but David is somebody, whether he does good, does bad, does tshuva, Hashem imach. God is with him, and he understands as the leader of Israel, as the king of Israel, that that's who he has to be. He has to be somebody who represents God and does that with leadership, with strength, and with great belief. And we see that in this chapter. He's the only one who's not scared. And it shows us in introducing him, the transformation from last chapter, Shaul to David, and then the continuation in this chapter. Shaul is supposed to fight Goliath. Shaul is the tall one. Shaul doesn't do it. Who does it instead? David. But David doesn't hide with the vessels. David doesn't go and wear Shaul's clothing. He's going to lead Bnei Israel, but he's going to do it in his own way.